Hello, and welcome to the 19th In Conversation, Mental Health, Loneliness, and Community. I'm Amanda Zamora, co-founder and publisher of the 19th. We're focusing on mental health today because the United States is grappling with a mental health crisis. 1 in 3 adults reported struggling with anxiety and loneliness in the last year. Those rates are even higher among young adults, LGBTQ+ people, and women. 3 years of separation, isolation, and fragmented social infrastructure have left so many of us muddling through these fraught times on our own. Today, we're talking about loneliness, finding community, and accessing mental health resources, especially for communities facing historic barriers to care. We've brought together a group of mental health professionals, advocates, and community leaders to help us unpack this. With that, I'd like to welcome Erin Haynes, the 19th editor-at-large. Erin?
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. I am excited to be joined by Nneka Ogwumike, president of the WNBA Players Association and an advocate for equality, opportunity, women's empowerment, and of course, health and wellness. You don't have to be an amazing athlete to relate to this conversation. So welcome, Nneka. Let's get started.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, listen, I just want to start by asking you to tell me a little bit about your mental health routine on an ideal day. What does prioritizing your mental health look like for you? And how has that changed since the pandemic started?
Oh, it has changed a lot since the pandemic started. I'm not sure if I had a mental health routine before the pandemic started. You know, you like to think that you're doing these things until something like as drastic as the pandemic really puts things into perspective. But your question said on an ideal day, and I think that's very important because more oftentimes than not, our days are not ideal. And so understanding how that routine can kind of ground you, even if you don't get to everything, certain aspects of a routine that can lay that foundation for you. So for me personally, my mornings and my nights are very sacred for me. I consider that very reverent time. I would say more so in the morning, you know, when I wake up, I try my best not to check any applications on my phone, really only like text messages and WhatsApps because I have a big family. So a lot of times it's important to look at that. But outside of that, you know, I usually spend a little bit of time in prayer and meditation before I get out of my bed. And then, you know, because of the nature of my profession, I work out a lot. And so I try my best to create kind of like a grounding routine when I'm getting ready for a workout. And on any given day, my workouts can be different, a little less so during the season. But what I like doing is in the mornings when I'm getting ready, because I don't really have the luxury of time to like really do as much as I want to when it comes to, I guess, like the performative aspects of like, you know, creating a mental health routine, whether it's journaling, you know, meditation, yoga. So what I like doing is I like creating a very organic and holistic approach to like my mental health. So because I know I have to wake up, get dressed, go and do, you know, Pilates and then my activation and go to the court, I try to use that time as almost like a silent retreat. So I don't take any phone calls. I don't say any words out loud. I just kind of almost like use that morning time as like a silent retreat for me to really like get in tune with my body, to think about the things that I'm grateful for, to think about what I want today to look like, and ultimately, you know, my wants and also my purpose, whether for the day or in my life. And so I use that time while I'm getting ready to ask those questions of myself. And then I kind of get through my day, especially after my workout. That's when I make my first phone calls. So a lot of times I'm like doing a silent retreat for between like 2 and 4 hours every morning where I'm not talking at all. And I really do love that. And I always like to say that today started last night. And so that's why my nights are very important. So I try my best to reserve spaces for what they're used for. So I don't eat in the bed, I eat in the kitchen. I try my best not to watch TV while I'm laying in the bed. I have like some seating area in front of my bed. So like if I want to watch TV, I try to sit there. And then I try to shut down all of my devices at a certain time. I journal every single night. And then when I go to sleep, I try to do like a body scan, which I think is kind of another form of like gratitude for me to just kind of like scan my body and like really think about how I felt, what it did today, and letting that set in. And a lot of times I start at my toes. I don't get to the top of my head before I fall asleep. So I would say that that was kind of like a quick way of summarizing like my mental health practices. And there's so many other different things that I do, not every day, but that are very helpful.
Yeah, today starts the night before, Nika. That is just very good advice. And also, I mean, hello, athletes are just like us, setting boundaries, minimizing screen time, exercising, finding gratitude. Those are all really good ways to kind of get and establish a mental health routine. But you did kind of allude to something, and we don't always get that right. Like, right, we were talking about what an ideal day of mental health looks like. And so what is one way that you would say that maybe you sabotage your mental health a little bit? And what do you do when that happens?
So one thing that I'm really working hard on right now is incorporating naps into like my mental health practice.
Yep.
And I just started following, oh, I forget her name, but on
That
Instagram,
ministry,
the Nap Ministry. Yeah.
Trisha,
And it
Percy,
being like
yes.
rest being a form of resistance. And so I love, love, love her page. I love that she's a Black woman too. And it's taught me a lot about my relationship with rest. And I think that it's very specific to women, it's very specific to women of color, that rest is just a four-letter word. And we're always trying to get things done. We also, bear the brunt of a lot of the responsibilities in our lives and those who we are close to in our lives. And so understanding that drowsiness is red alert. I took a class at Stanford called Sleep and Dreams, and Dr. Dement, he always told us drowsiness is red alert. And a lot of times I fight drowsiness during the day because I feel like things need to get done. And so that is one way of how I almost kind of sabotage my mental health. But it's been a goal of mine for over a year and a half now to incorporate naps as a part of my mental health and to value the importance of rest.
Yes, yes. Well, not to go too far down that rabbit hole, but I am also a member of the Nap Ministry congregation, and rest is our right. It is not something that we earn. It is not something that we have to do so that we can get ready to do more work. It is
Mhm.
something that we deserve. And so, yes, embrace the nap. Nika, I hope that you get more naps coming up here in 2023. I hope everyone watching gets more naps coming up because we need them, especially as Black women. And speaking of that, I mean, how do you think that gender and race can exacerbate kind of dealing with some of these mental health challenges that you talk about?
I mean, we can start anywhere, but I guess, if we kind of like really break it down to the bones, being a woman in this world, the system was not designed for you. And so, in a lot of ways, you have to work more to get half as far. And so that really puts a strain on our relationship of what rest looks like. And then that now kind of projects into stigmas and stereotypes of, a resting woman is a lazy woman, or a resting woman is a woman that's being taken care of, or this idea that people prefer to have a woman that's just sitting at home and not working. There's so many different projections of this, and it's unfortunate. And I mean, we haven't even really tapped into the fact that, we bring children into this world. We are biologically the caregiver first, and in a lot of ways on a deeper level. And so that also adds these false expectations of our relationship with rest, others' relationship with what rest looks like for women, and whether we deserve it or not. And I think it's something that's important to always note. I always love having the conversation around mental wellness and health and rest with Black women, because there's something we understand each other always when we talk about this. And I was just talking to a friend about this the other day about, how hard it is to be a Black woman, because you're stuck between a rock and a hard place with almost everything. And mental wellness and health and rest is certainly one of those delicate subjects that we really need to try and break the barrier. But I would say amongst each other first, and then we'll be able to really create this movement where we're more understood with when it comes to rest and Black women.
Yeah, I do think you're onto something in terms of the idea that maybe there's strength in numbers. Part of that stigma is isolating, right? People feeling like oh, well, if she's doing all these things and she's so amazing, I should be able to do this too. And really, we have no idea what somebody is going through, and all the Black women in her may be tired too, right? And so really talking about this and sharing our stories collectively can help people understand that they're not alone in this, and that it helps for us to be in community, in conversation about these issues. So thank you for saying that. Thank you for helping to lead that conversation. I want to ask you, I guess, kind of to that point, the challenges for you to normalize mental health, whether that's with your family, with your friends, with colleagues, with the players that you are tasked with working with. How do you balance your mental health priorities with the demands of work?
I mean, it's really, I think that's incredibly subjective, but in terms of kind of encouraging myself to do it and also what it looks like for those around me, I'm very, very principally based. And so when I want to try to incorporate something, I don't try to do something I've never done. I try to figure out how to weave it into what I already do. And so a lot of, I nap every game day because I know I need it. And so I know I'm capable. And so like trying to kind of like put myself into the zone of like, you know what, midday nap. But then also being encouraged by family members and friends. I have plenty of family members and friends that take naps. My dad takes naps. So even trying to like sequence my naps with his, when he tells me he's about to take a nap, maybe that's a signal that I should take a nap. And I encourage others to rest as well. I try my best to encourage like my sisters to take breaks, to take vacations, because they do a lot of work. And a lot of times too, when you can plan to rest together, like you said, like doing outside of isolation is also very helpful. In my job too, I think it's almost kind of become like sage advice now with me being in the league for so long. I try to impart upon the younger players the kind of like the secret sauce to longevity in professional sports. It's not necessarily getting up more shots. It's not necessarily, strength and conditioning work every day. The sooner you know how to rest your body and recover, the longer your career can last. And so learning that for me, I would say like at a pretty decent age, especially comparatively speaking to like the veterans that kind of reared me, it's allowed me to figure out different ways that I can rest. Sometimes it may not just be like physically taking a nap. Sometimes it means, instead of going out to eat, I'll order in, and I'll just kind of stay in the comfort of my own home. It's not, I don't think it's when you hear the word radical, you think that it's something big, but a lot of what can be changed is very nuanced in our lives. But I think we program ourselves to believe that those are not options because they're a waste of time, because things need to get done. So kind of also altering my perspective on like, this needs to get done now, but it's gonna be there for me when I wake up anyway. So I might as well rest.
Not going anywhere.
It's not going there's always going to be something to do. And so just really understanding that.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you're making too, just about what rest can look like and what we think about. I mean, the radical part of it is kind of what we've been programmed to believe about who deserves rest, and what rest should look like. But yes, I mean, rest doesn't even have to be, an hours long nap, right? I'm a big fan of the power nap, but also, yeah, I mean, you can hike, you can meditate, you can daydream, there are many different ways to rest that really just are not necessarily about a nap, but a way of recharging our spirit, our body, our mind. So as president of the Players Association, I just want to ask you about the conversation that you're having with players. What are the challenges that they're telling you that they're having around this issue? And how are you really talking to them about recognizing when they might need help and how they can get it?
Yeah, I think that this was kind of a point of emphasis in our last collective bargaining agreement, understanding, the player experience and then, of course, health and safety. And a lot of times as athletes, people don't think about mental health being a part of the game. But without a sound mind, you can't use your body to, perform at a high level. And these conversations brought about, different struggles that players have, whether it's players who have kids and, need some type of caregiving or need some access to a mental health resource for either them or their children. Players who actually do need mental health resources made available either through the league or through the union, understanding who the league doctor is that can provide those mental health resources. And there's a lot of players, including me, who didn't know that we had a head doctor when it comes to mental health resources. And then there's programming surrounding mental health in the PA and in the WNBA, not just regarding the general everyday aspects of it, but also these global and societal traumas that we experience, and needing to still show up and do our jobs in a way where you don't have time to process it. And a lot of times the players deal with a lot because we don't have time to process it. We're trying to understand what's going on. We have to play at a high level, and we also want to use our platforms to advocate. And so that weighs a lot on the mind and the body and the spirit. And it's been wonderful seeing all the different ways that we can provide resources for players to make sure that they're balanced, and to also afford them the opportunity and the agency to really take care of themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that you are somebody who's being so proactive about this, but I think you're also kind of giving good advice for folks, regardless of what their workplace is, to be proactive about finding out what resources are available to them, if they are available, hopefully in the places where they work. So your profession is one that comes with advantages like teamwork, like discipline, right? But then there is a lot of that pressure that you referred to that comes with being an elite athlete. Can you just talk about how that contributes to mental health challenges?
I think when we first enter the league, the transition may not hit us quite yet, because it's just something you've been doing for so long. And now all of a sudden it's a business and they want to pay you to do it, and it's a job. And so understanding kind of the tumultuous and the volatile nature of the business really is I think, kind of the gateway for mental health. Understanding that an injury could mean, your career is over, is also another aspect that contributes to honing in on what it means to be balanced in a mental way. And then also, things like retirement, those are things that are unique to us, because you have most of our players retiring in their 30s, and that doesn't sound normal, but this is all they know. And so understanding what resources are available for them to deal with that transition, and then also expand mental awareness, a healthy awareness to like what could be next. And I think taking it day by day and not being too hard, and just giving yourself and others grace is really the only way to remain balanced, or to be always looking to achieve balance. Sometimes you're not always going to get it, but as I said before, understanding those resources, and a lot of times those resources aren't just specifically a medical professional. A lot of times the resources can be those who are directors that can help you solve a problem. And because a lot of times you don't know what resources are available. And I think it's important, especially for everyone in every workplace, more oftentimes than not, the resources are available, they're just not communicated to you. And we're discovering that increasingly so in the W. So when a player wants to retire, when a player wants to freeze her eggs, when a player is looking for a workers' comp for an injury, these things can be solved. And just understanding that there's guidance and there's ways to figure out how to solve them, and that you are not alone in trying to solve this problem, are huge aspects to maintaining balanced mental health. And then, of course, having specific resources that target that can, of course, add the cherry on top a lot of times.
Yeah. Yeah, giving yourself grace around mental health for life is really so important. And like you said, not being afraid to ask for help, and it being okay, for you not to know, because there are people that can help you if you just ask. I think those are all such important points. Well, I want to end this conversation by just asking you, just one takeaway that you would give our audience from this conversation that could really help somebody get started on their mental health journey.
I mean, I'd have to say that the biggest takeaway is that mental health looks different for everyone. I think, especially in this socially digital age, there's a lot of aesthetic around mental health that
Mhm.
makes you feel like if you're not doing one of these 10 things and it's not working for you, then you may not have any type of solution. But incorporating, daily things in life, and I think an easy way to discover what's good for your mental health are just doing things, or even figuring out the things you do on a daily or not on a daily that really just bring you joy.
Mhm.
For me, music brings me joy. And so, a lot of times, like when I'm feeling a certain way, I'm like, man, I just want to play some music, and it'll increase my mood, and it's very simple, but everyone has different things that bring them joy. And starting there can really lead you down um towards the, I guess, the arsenal of things that you can use when you're feeling a certain way. And then ultimately too, that you're probably not the only person that shares that type of interest, or that probably not the only person that brings you joy. And then you kind of discover a community. And then also too, understanding, especially in the Black community, um, aside from the things that bring us joy, because I think the Black community does a really excellent job of like laughing through pain. But
Mhm.
I don't think that we should diminish the importance of professional help. Unfortunately, mental health resources have been deemed a luxury for so long, and are quite faux pas in the Black community. And kind of destigmatizing that is incredibly important, because there are resources that exist today, that I don't think put the financial strain on what people may deem to be a luxury, in their lives. And just kind of seeking out those different resources, asking a friend what they do, and understanding that there are professionals. Just like when you go to the doctor and your stomach hurts, there's someone who you can go to if it's not all well up here. Yeah, so those are just kind of like my biggest takeaways.
Well, Nika, I think this is a great note to end this on. I thank you so much for your insights. I thank you so much for your leadership and for joining us today in this conversation. And now I'll hand it back over to our publisher, Amanda Zamora.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. We're talking about mental health today, but in this conversation, we're talking about it in the context of community. To do that, I'm here with Mexican-American poet and author Erica Sanchez and TikToker and activist Davy Felton. I really enjoyed learning more about both of you. You're working in really different spaces, but from what I can see, you have at least two things in common. You are normalizing and destigmatizing the conversation about mental health in our culture in really important ways. And you're doing it in ways that inspire vulnerability and joy. And this is where I'd like to start. Could I ask you to describe the nature of your work and the communities that you're hoping to reach through that work? So Erica, we'll start with you. How did you get into writing, and who are you aiming to reach through that writing?
Yeah, I got into writing at the age of 12 because I loved to read and I wanted to be able to write the things that I couldn't say out loud and wrestle with all of these emotions and experiences that I had. And I felt like there was no one to really understand me. So the page was the place where I can express exactly what I wanted to express. And so my work speaks directly to the Mexican community, Mexican American, Latino community. It's work that, in many ways, transgresses the things that we hold very dear in our culture. Many of them, and it's work that I feel is really important in terms of mental health, because Latinas suffer from mental illness at really high rates, and it's something that's kind of just invisible in our culture. And so that's who I aim to reach, because that's what I needed when I was younger. That's still what I need right now.
You've talked about how important books were to you as a young person growing up in the 90s, finding your own voice. You were looking for voices, as you just said, who reflected more of your lived experience. And I want to fast forward to now, actually. We're in this time where we do have more representation, thankfully, in culture and in literature. Not enough, but more. And there's also more backlash. And, not far from where I am here in Austin, Texas, in Llano County, officials are considering closing all of their public libraries rather
my
than following a federal judge's order to reinstate banned books. And so I wonder how you, as a writer, as a Latina, as someone who found books to be the lifeline and that you needed, how do you receive news like that? How do you observe news like that? What's the response to this kind of trend in your writers community? And like, what's your take on that?
I mean, we're all horrified, honestly. It reeks of fascism. It is fascism. To control the knowledge that people have access to is wrong. And I know that my novel has been banned throughout the country, and many different reasons have been cited, but ultimately I think it's the fear of the other. It's because they don't want us to exist, especially in such a bold and public way. And so yeah, I've been fighting the book bans in my own ways. I went to Utah to protest because they were banning books there, and I went to the state capitol, and it was just, yeah, it's tiring. It's like, I just want to write books, and I want young people to have access to those books, because I needed books when I was growing up. I survived because of books, because otherwise I feel like my life wouldn't have had much meaning, because everything was so difficult, and books for me were this hope, this way out of where I was.
Stakes are so high. Davy, I'd like to talk more about your work with and for the queer community in Oregon, but also on TikTok and beyond. Can you talk a little bit more about how you got started there, what you're trying to accomplish, who you're trying to connect with?
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, my journey on TikTok started kind of as a product of the pandemic. I was working as an innkeeper at a bed and breakfast that was shut down due to the fact that my owner no longer wanted to own a bed and breakfast in a pandemic. And as I was losing my job, I picked up TikTok out of sheer boredom. But then I found community, and TikTok has been as much a part of my personal journey as I am now a part of the advocacy for queer people on TikTok. That being said, I found representation there. I found people who thought and looked and acted and had views like mine on TikTok. I learned more about the diversity of gender expression. And I learned more and more that it was okay for me to truly be who I was. And I started presenting that way more and more on TikTok, and I found more community. It was amazing to find the reciprocation of people who were following me, also saying that their struggles, that their feelings, that what they were dealing with was very similar to what I was going through, and they were happy to see that representation. Now, as far as what I'm doing here in Central Oregon, I've just started a project to provide gender-affirming clothing to our queer neighbors for no cost or donation. It's called the Traveling Trans Trailer, and it is just getting up and going, and I'm very excited about the support that I've already received. We've got hundreds of pounds of clothing to go through already, and a great big trailer to haul it all around in. So I'm very excited about that.
I'm going to ask you about that, how it started and how it's going. So that's awesome. I want to talk a little bit more about social media. You're obviously, Davy, you've grown an incredible following. You've got, I think, more than 870,000 people following you on TikTok.
It's amazing.
It's quite an audience. But my question is, on social media, right? It's a double-edged sword. We've seen social media be a lifeline for oppressed groups to find community, to organize, and to hold power to account. I'm thinking about all the viral videos on police brutality is just one example. But we've also seen, social media companies perpetuate harm and polarization and misinformation, and it's, left us with this really uneasy relationship with social. Last year, Pew conducted a global study on attitudes around social media and found of all the 19 countries that they surveyed, the United States was the most likely to say that social media was bad for democracy. It's like we're having this real struggle. And I think both of you have pretty different approaches to social media, relationships with social media. And I'm just curious how you all navigate that tension as people who see social media as obviously a place to connect with communities in these spaces, but also as folks who are, by virtue of your identities, the kind of folks who are going to be more vulnerable to harm and harassment in those spaces. So maybe I'll start with you. You know, what is your approach to navigating those tensions? Like, what has your experience been on TikTok? I think I read also recently you're not even on Facebook and Instagram anymore because they've shut. Like, talk to me about how you've been navigating all of this.
Yeah, unfortunately, at a protest, I caught the attention of some very bad actors, and they reported me falsely to Meta, Facebook and Instagram, and got my accounts taken down. It's one of the things that I've had to deal with. And fortunately, I now have a new account that's all opened back up again, but I was never able to retrieve my old information. And I receive a fair amount of backlash in my comment section or during my lives that is not great. It doesn't make you feel, but you know, I will say this, I have been the subject of bullying most of my life. I think most of the queer community can say that they have been the subject of some sort of bullying throughout their life. This is not unfamiliar to me. It's just presented in a different way. My response towards that type of feedback or pushback is to simply block and ignore. I'm not one of the creators who will dress down a bad actor in public and try to argue a point that I know won't be heard by the person that made the comment. So I have great moderators during my live streams that just block with impunity. We just don't allow, we build the community we want. Honestly, in my following, it is really about respect for each other and for ourselves. I end all of my live streams with be kind to yourself and be kind to others. I think those are two really important things. If we're kind to ourselves, if we practice self-love, we have less of a tendency to be awful to other people. And so it is really a tendency to drown out those awful voices with the positive and affirming voices of my community. And I do that in real life too.
Very positive attitude. It's also a big burden. I'm curious, are there things that you want to see from the platforms in terms of making, you know, shifting the burden to them or changes in their platform design? Or
I feel like that is a huge obstacle for all social media companies. Is like, where do you draw the line between monitoring and watching out for bullying and bad actors, and then limiting free speech? You know, how do you navigate that? And I would not want to be the person that has to try to figure out where to draw those lines and how to make that happen in a technology-based atmosphere. It is truly something that needs to be addressed more and more. I feel like some of the platforms are getting better. I noticed, honestly, the false reports that I've had on TikTok have dwindled over the last year and a half. It used to be a real problem that bad actors would just use the reporting system on social media to get creators like me banned or reported. I feel like that's happening less.
But what about you? Are you using social media? I mean, you're trying to build awareness, obviously, for your books, but how are you approaching social?
Very carefully now. I feel just a lot more guarded because I'm more of a public figure than I was before when I started, and so I don't include my family in posts because that makes me feel really weird and gross. And so that's something that I keep very private. And I use it to bring attention to certain issues. For instance, I just lost my job at DePaul, And I wanted to bring attention to the hypocrisy of the administration wanting to make this a Hispanic serving institution, and yet, just deleting resources and people from students. And so that created like this big media hubbub. But as far as like, I don't want to do that all the time. That I find that very exhausting. It makes me feel very tense and anxious, and that's just not how I want to live. And so I limit my social media use for my own well-being, because I don't want to get depressed talking about depression on social media, like it's just a weird cycle. And I'm very, very worried about what it's doing to teen girls in particular, and how devastating these apps are for their mental well-being. And so I'm very vigilant, I'm very skeptical. I'm worried about my children using it at some point, because it's real life, but it's not really real life. It's this weird space that I think we haven't quite defined yet. And so I think it's very, very useful, but it's also very, very dangerous. And at this point, I only have Instagram. I've deleted everything else just out of principle. And I feel better for it.
To talk a little bit more about the weight of this moment, Davy, your TikTok presence was inspired by, the pandemic. It was a thing that came out of the pandemic. And I think one of the big lessons from the pandemic for a lot of us was this obvious need for connection and community. I was one of those people. I was completely isolated for the better part of a year. I lived alone. I lost my last, living parent in 2020. But in the end, I developed this like newfound hunger to rediscover my roots, my heritage, my sense of belonging and community. So if there's a silver lining for folks, maybe that's one. But I'm also just struck that we haven't had this collective opportunity to grieve what we lost in COVID, much less all of these other issues that we're touching on in this conversation. And my question for both of you would be, first of all, how do you think that we can connect with communities or lean on communities to help us grieve? Do we need to grieve collectively? And also, how can we be showing up for people who might be experiencing grief and loneliness when it's hard to recognize? We're very dialed into what we're experiencing. Sometimes we miss what others are experiencing.
I do feel like we've had a chance at least to talk about some of those issues on social media and in real life. It comes up in conversations with people that I talk to all the time, the things that are different now. It's the things that feel like we're living in a completely different space than we were 3 years ago. But also I would say that through that, we have had some real conversations on social media that have taken our leadership kind of by surprise. They have been really worried about what we the people are actually talking about, the changes that we want to see. And we see a lot of that happening, and there's pushback to it as well. There's resistance from people who are uncomfortable with change, seeing the change that has come out of people across the world banding together and presenting a unified front against the things that we see as injustices in the world. And we do that more and more by talking to each other, by sharing ideas. And I think that is the benefit that we see coming out of social media.
Yeah, I think that social media has done incredible things for humanity in many different ways. And, revolutions have been started on social media. I find that really exciting. But then there's like the darker side of social media, and Davy was talking about, bad actors, trolls, and people who are extremely hateful, who come out because they're able to be anonymous. And so it's like this constant like negotiation, I think, for me. And I think that for children, they don't have that capacity yet to negotiate. So they are like consumed by it at times. And so that I suppose that's what troubles me the most.
A few of our readers have asked questions about sort of practical, they're looking for practical guidance on overcoming loneliness. And I wonder if in exploring possibilities, what the alternatives are to social media in terms of finding connection and community, maybe that you all have experienced. Obviously, there's potential in social media, but there are other avenues. Some of the questions that we've gotten include Emily, a 19th reader who says she's curious about loneliness and life transitions when moving to a new city, as well as finding connection in a remote work environment. Christine is wondering how to overcome loneliness and feeling left out and feeling behind in life, like finding her purpose. I feel like writing has been one way that I've like tried to hone in on finding purpose and voice. Mel is looking for practical advice on how to find communities and steps to take if you're looking to start a community. I'm curious if you both have, you know, practical advice to give to folks who are hungry and still searching for ways to connect, whether it's on social media or in real life, in community spaces. Erica, what about you?
Yeah, I feel that when I'm among people in real life, I'm the most joyful. And so for me, I need to make that happen. And what I think some of the most loneliest times of my life have been when I didn't really connect with a lot of people. And so now that I'm older and I know what I need, I feel like, for instance, I've been interviewing women for a book that I'm writing, and it's like women who remind me of my mother and my aunts, and we have a really fun time talking, and that's something that's bringing me joy right now. So it's like trying to find people through a shared passion, perhaps, like maybe join a church if that's what you want, or take a class if you can do that. Just start doing things that you love, and I feel like typically people emerge like in an organic way. I don't know if that's like the best method, but that's something that really works for me, to like just follow something that I really care about, and then you'll find your community at some point. And I did that with writing. I have like a huge community of writers that I feel I can rely on. And so yeah, just do something you love and really go for it.
And also, it sounds like get out in the world that you live in.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Davey, what about you?
I would love to second what Erica said about making that choice to get out. I discovered after spending a while on TikTok and building that community there that I had really done very little with my local queer community at all. Like I had stayed cloistered, and it's fun to build community online, but when you turn off that phone, you're sitting in a room alone. You're by yourself again, and it really does need to be a choice to go out into your actual community in real life and connect with people there. I would say if you're looking for ways to do that, volunteer. I was told by a mentor of mine years ago, when you are feeling sad about yourself and about the world, go out and volunteer. You will feel instantly better. So find ways to volunteer. Find a game group or a trivia group in your neighborhood. Go out and connect with real people in real life. Social media is great, but when you turn off that phone, you're alone in your room. So please do make the effort. We've forgotten kind of how to do that in the pandemic, but go out and touch grass and see real people. You may want to put on a mask depending on who you're around or how many people are there, but go do it.
Sort of on this note of in the practical advice arena, part of mental health is learning how to care for ourselves fully, right? And understanding how our emotional and our mental well-being are tied to our bodily well-being and vice versa. And also just understanding, how to process our emotions. And for many of us, that may include the traumas that underlie some of those emotions. I would really love to hear a little bit more about your own sort of relationship with mental wellness, and if there are things that you have developed in terms of good habits for self-care. Like, what are your go-to things that you do? What are your rituals in terms of self-care? And are there tips that you have also for when people are experiencing that overwhelm? Davey, I was watching your TikToks the other day, and you talked about like this latest wave of news about the shootings in Nashville, like the looking for the helpers. I thought that was such a beautiful, hopeful tip. But like, what are, talk to us a little bit more about your own sort of mental wellness journey and sort of your habits for self-care. Erica, I'll start with you this time.
Yeah, I think self-care in my community for women is very rarely encouraged. You're seen as selfish if you do things that are not for your family. And so that's something that I've had to break, and it's been very difficult. But I feel like I've achieved that, or maybe it's an ongoing thing. I don't know. But I realize, I mean, it's very simple, but if I'm happy, my daughter's happy. Like, she cannot be happy if I'm miserable. So I better do my best to take care of myself, because otherwise it's a disservice to her, And so that's how I think now as a parent, that I have to be equipped to protect her. And that means like going on walks all the time when I need it. That means putting her in daycare because I can't take care of her all day because I have things to do. That means, asking people for help. That means, which includes like my parents taking care of the baby, or, meditation. Meditation has played a huge part in my life in the recent weeks, and reading to understand myself better. And one book that I keep thinking about that has changed me very, very deeply is called The Pain We Carry, and it's by Natalie Y. Gutierrez, and it's about PTSD and people of color, and how to cope and how to transcend, and where it all comes from. I mean, it's just like this really life-changing book that it's hard to summarize, but that has changed a lot for me.
Thank you. I'm going to look that up. Davey, what about you?
I think I've said it before to a lot of people that my TikTok started out kind of as a gentle reminder to myself to do certain things. So if you ever see my TikToks on there saying, remember to look for the helpers, or remember to drink your water, or do this or do that, it's really pointed, the lens is pointed at me. It's like, you need to remember to do those things. Just remembering to do simple things in your life can be such amazing self-care. Drinking enough water during the day, just remembering to feed yourself and not go without food. Getting in the shower for a lot of people is just the hardest thing to do in their life, especially now that so many are living and working at home. It's just like those little self-care moments are so, so important. I joke with a lot of my followers in the queer community, hydrate or die straight. You gotta get your water in. You're just a big walking bag of water. So those are the self-care things. Now, of course, people ask me all the time, what do I do when I'm feeling anxious or depressed? And honestly, for each person, it's a little bit different. I love to go out and get in my car and sing at the top of my voice. It gets the oxygen flowing. It makes your brain look for lyrics in its little filing cabinet. It does a lot of things to activate your body and your mind. For me, that work. Now, that may not work for somebody else. Somebody else is like, I'm not getting in my car and singing. I don't care if I'm by myself. That's embarrassing. But do what you can. I tell people, your journey of self-care is going to be yours. If you can't get out and go for a walk, get the windows open and at least, get some sunshine in your space. If you can't afford to go for therapy sessions, at least sit down and write out your feelings for a while. Get those on paper so you can see them. It varies for every single person, but as long as we're remembering ourselves, it's that whole, putting on your oxygen mask before helping somebody else. we're going to be useless to other people unless we take care of ourselves. And we are here to help take care of other people.
I need more solo car karaoke in my life, I think.
I think so, yes.
We're just about out of time. Before we go, how can people find your work online? Erica, where can people find more about your books and your writing?
EricaLSanchez.com, and I'm also on Instagram under the same handle.
Terrific. Davey, how can people find you on TikTok?
I am Dave Felton on TikTok and on YouTube, and now my new Instagram and Facebook, which have no content because I just put them up yesterday, is Davey TikTok, DAVIE TikTok.
Good. That is wonderful. Thank you both for being so generous with your time and your wisdom today. A final note before we close, if you or someone that you know is in crisis, dial 988 for the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. You can also check out the National Alliance on Mental Illness at NAMI.org or the Human Rights Campaign at HRC.org for more mental health resources. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the 19th Jennifer Gerson to continue this conversation on loneliness.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm here now with Jessica Gross, the author of Screaming on the Inside, The Unsustainability of American Motherhood, and an opinion writer at the New York Times. Jess, I'm so excited that I get to have this conversation with you because I don't know if you remember, but you were one of the first people I reached out to when I was pregnant with my oldest child, and I had terrible hyperemesis, and I thought I was losing my mind because I had never been pregnant before, and I was suddenly trying to figure out how to do my job and throw up all day long, which you were the only person I knew who had had that experience. And I said, I just feel so alone right now. I don't feel like anyone can understand. And 10 years later, you've written like an entire book about feeling lonely in motherhood. And I am so grateful to have read this book now. So first of all, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And of course I remember because I became sort of the hyperemesis Sherpa for unfortunately too many people, because I think it's something that not a lot of obstetricians are necessarily trained to handle particularly well. And I've heard from lots of people near and far that sometimes their symptoms were sort of dismissed, and because of the uniquely terrible healthcare system that we live in, it is hard to find a way to keep your job and be so sick. And so it's a really challenging time. So as always, very sad that you went through it, but was very happy to be a resource for you or for anybody.
A great resource. And I feel like something we talked about then, and I'm excited to talk about more today, is, and that you talk about throughout in your book and that your columns at the Times talk about constantly, is that we are increasingly talking more about the realities of motherhood from pregnancy forward, and just the way that these experiences can feel really isolating and lonely. And I was thinking about you as I was preparing for this. I just passed a neighbor the other day when I was out walking, and she had her 6-week-old with her. And I did the cursory, "How are you doing?" And she goes, "No one told me I was going to feel lonely." And she said, "I've been calling all my friends and saying, you kept that from me. No one told me this." And you talk about this all the time, and we have so much conversation about it now, but I feel like you still bump into new parents on the street and this is what they're saying. Why do you think this is, as we have more and more attention to the realities of the difficulty from conception forward of what motherhood can feel like for so many people? I think people still feel really uniquely alone and struggling with that as they become parents. Why do you think that is?
I think there's so many reasons. I think the first, though, is you just can't know what something's going to be like until you go through it. So especially if it's a wanted child, you want to engage in sort of magical thinking. You want to think, well, other people were lonely, but it won't be like that for me. It'll be really joyous and beautiful. And like, who wouldn't want to feel that way? I mean, who wants to think like, oh, I'm going to feel really complicated when this thing that I really desperately wanted and this identity that I chose to take on doesn't feel as good as it felt like it was going to be. So I think it completely makes sense that even as we continue to talk about it, there's nothing we can really do to prepare, because the fantasy of the, perfect new motherhood is so alluring. I think another part of it is, for so many reasons, we don't have the support systems in place that we need after we give birth. Just from not having paid parental leave, especially for a lot of non-birthing partners, we are actually alone. My husband had a day of paternity leave with our second child, and I think he had about a week with our first child. And I just remember, especially with our first child, just feeling like I could make it to about 4 p.m. and then looking at the clock and being like, when are you coming home? When are you coming home? When are you coming home? So you are actually alone, and family can come and help for some period of time, but this historically just isn't the way that people have raised children. I was reading oral history that we had done with my maternal grandmother before she died, and she described the way that she grew up, which was her whole family lived in the same apartment building in Vienna. There were cousins everywhere. There were, she was in and out of her aunts and uncles' houses. They ate meals together, extended family. There were people in and out at the table. And in the United States, certainly there are people who still have that, and a lot of people don't. So I think that there's sort of just multiple reasons why, practical and identity reasons why we feel lonely, especially as we are making this very big transition into new parenthood.
And what do you think some of these trickle down effects? We know that the loneliness is so real. I mean, that you talk to any parent, you hear about that, especially any birthing parent. And given, like you said, the kind of lack of support systems, especially in the United States, and then knowing that we're in this kind of mental health crisis in this country too, how do you help people, you think, maybe make a connection, or what do you think the connection is between these things and the fact that people are giving birth and then feeling really acutely and uniquely lonely? What's the rest of the sentence? Like, what happens next? How do you fill in that blank? And what do we do in your dream world about it?
Oh man, in my dream world, I have so many ideas. I think one thing I just want to be really sure to mention, because I think it's almost under discussed as a cause of loneliness, negative feeling, depression, whatever you want to call it in the postpartum period, is lack of sleep. Everyone knows that when you have a baby, you don't get a lot of sleep, but there is just so much data between, a prolonged period of sleeplessness and mental health consequences. And so often just, if I'm talking to friends who are new parents, the first thing I will do is counsel them to just get one solid night of sleep. I know it sounds so simplistic, but I actually even hear this in my reporting about teens and mental health. Teens are sleeping much less, and it is really a huge burden on mental health. So I know that sounds like simplistic or silly, but sleep is huge. And especially if you're doing everything alone, you are simply exhausted. And so it is nearly impossible, I would say, to feel, you're most mentally well when you're just so incredibly sleep deprived. So that I just wanted to put that out there as, just one small thing that you can do. But in my dream world, I mean, how would I change the way that parents give birth in the United States? Oh my God, universal health care. It would not be so expensive. You would not, I got $1,000 bill for my second child's birth before I stepped into the hospital. I was like, what if I gave birth in a taxi? How are you charging me for this thing that I haven't even done yet? So, costs lowering would be nice, and guarantee that you will have, the things covered that you need covered. Parental leave, paid parental leave, so you don't have to worry about doing your job, and keeping a roof over your head. I think, again, something that is unquantifiable is not just the lack of resources that you have when you don't get paid parental leave, but the added stress. I don't know that we have a way to measure the added anxiety from not knowing that you'll have a job to go back to not knowing that you're going to be able to support your family for a prolonged period of time. All of that, just so much additional stress that weighs on people. Those are sort of the two big ones. Another thing would be, in other countries, they have a robust system of nursing visits. So in the immediate postpartum period, you will have a nurse come to your house a couple times a week for a period of time to make sure that you're okay, that nursing is going okay if that's what you want to do, that the family unit is functioning okay. And just knowing that you have someone looking out for you like that is immeasurable. A fourth thing that, again, some of our peer nations do is they have more coordinated motherhood centers, motherhood groups where, you know, new parents have a place to go, they have a place to gather, they have a place to meet that together when they have babies around the same time. And of course, there's ad hoc ways of doing that through Facebook groups, but it's all DIY in the United States, as are so many things. So, you know, in terms of making the postpartum period easier, I think it's all of those things.
Well, to kind of jump in reverse to the other end of that spectrum, something you talk about in your book and in such a great and nuanced way, and felt really resonant in this idea of performing pregnancy, and that this kind of loneliness and anxiety starts almost from the moment of conception, and people feel the need. And I know we talked about it when I had hyperemesis 8 years ago, of feeling like, well, I'm supposed to be beautiful, glowing, tossing my hair and wearing my perfect social media pregnancy outfits, but I'm throwing up all day long, or I'm exhausted. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to arrange for childcare. I just don't feel like myself, and I'm trying to figure out who I'm going to be when this other person comes into the world. What do you think that this, and from talking to so many people, talking to so many parents, what are you hearing from people about how this idea of performing pregnancy is creating the system of anxiety and loneliness from the get-go, and how does that compound as people move through the parenting life cycle?
So I think even if you don't feel you need to post your own pictures, though I think a lot of people do feel that they need to, seeing the idealized pregnancy just in your face constantly the second you're on Instagram, TikTok less so, but you know, just these images of looking beautiful, saying how blessed and wonderful every moment is, even if in your heart you know that it's BS, something gets, it just worms its way into you, and you think that that's how you should feel, how you should behave, how you should look, and I think it just really puts these unrealistic pressures on so many of us. If our pregnancies don't feel great all the time, if we don't look our best selves, I mean, I wrote a Vogue article around the publication of the book about how I have almost no photographs of my first pregnancy because, like you, I had hyperemesis, but as a result, because I was getting so few nutrients, my hair was falling out, I had terrible acne. I looked like a goblin. Like, I did not want to see anyone. I did not want anyone to see me. I could barely get out of bed. It was not something I wanted. Not only did I not want to project it to an audience, it was not something I wanted to hold on to for posterity. And so I think, you know, women who are in a position like you or I were can really feel this additional layer of, I guess, inadequacy, because we're not in any way living up to that sort of idealized image, which again, intellectually, we know it is fake. Like, it's 2023. We're grown-ups. We know that the internet is not real. And so even to, you know, as someone as sort of steeped in these issues as I am, I'm always surprised at how I can be caught off guard with feeling. Even, you know, my older daughter will be 11 this year. And there's still times where I'll see an image or see something somebody will say, and I'll just be like, a wave of guilt or failure will sort of just, you know, wash over me in such a way. And so, yeah, it's really intense. And it is a new kind of facet of motherhood that obviously didn't exist before social media.
You talk about in your book too, how, and this goes right into what you were just saying about this idea of how failure ends up fueling so many of our feelings, I think, as mothers, especially. And this idea that self-sacrifice is intrinsic to the idea of American motherhood. And if you aren't sacrificing enough of yourself, you're not doing a good job. If you're not putting yourself dead last at all times, somehow you've completely failed at what the game is supposed to be. How have you seen this in your own reporting? What are you hearing from folks? And how do you think this, again, just builds on this really vicious cycle? It seems like we're setting, especially birthing parents, up to engage in from the jump.
Yeah, I mean, I think the root of so much of it is just what a deeply individualistic country the United States is. So you do, in fact, have to figure a bunch of stuff out yourself. There are no systems that exist. Childcare is the biggest one. If you would simply like to continue working and also being a parent, it's not like, oh, I live in Paris and so there's a creche and I can, the state helps run it and I know exactly how much it's going to cost, and that's a fixed cost, and it's, all of these things, and it's subsidized. It's, I live in a big city or I live in a rural area. Is there childcare available? Can I get on the list? I saw someone, Josie Duffy Rice, tweet the other day that she got an email from a daycare that she had put her son on the list for when he was 6 months old, and he is now 6. That is, you really are having to compete, and there's no other way to say it, with other parents for these spots, which are finite. So the journey almost starts in so many ways, knowing that you are competing with other parents for a finite amount of resources simply to continue supporting your family. Like, that's from the jump. And so there's so many ways in which parents feel like if they are not informed about all of the things and how all of the things should work, and they don't know first, they're going to completely miss out and ultimately feel that they have not given their child the childhood that they, should have, or that they want them to have. I mean, another example, and this sounds silly, is sports. Sports have taken over parents' lives in such a way that seems completely foreign to me, even as someone who played a lot of sports in my youth, just in terms of the competitiveness, the expense, how it can't just be a casual rec leave. It immediately goes to an expensive travel team that you're fighting for spots with other people. And oh, if my kid doesn't get an athletic scholarship to college, they're never going to make it in the world. Like, there's just so many ways things that should be unstressful day-to-day activities for parents and children become a frenzied arm race. And it just is so uniquely American, which is not to say that, parents don't feel these pressures in other countries, but there are ways in which we make things seem like you're either winning or you're losing in the parenting game, that I don't think other countries are quite the same.
And we have time for about one more question, but with all of that in mind, something I actually really wanted to talk to you about today is, what do you think let's call it trickle down, in lack of a better word, is of this pressure cooker that parents are under, this intense competition, this just overwhelming loneliness, and this real mental health strain? What impact is this having on our kids? And we know that, there's that recent CDC report. We know that especially teenage girls are really in an acute mental health crisis right now and facing kind of unprecedented level of really intense and negative feelings. Do you think, again, you write so much about these dynamics and how the experiences of parents are impacting their children. How are you thinking about this right now, and what we're doing to parents is doing to our kids?
I mean, I certainly think that there's something to the argument that it's stressing them out. Our notions of scarcity are making them think that, opportunities are scarce for them. And I think it's a huge mistake. The one thing that honestly, I would say that very few things I've reported on have caused me to sort of change aspects of my parenting. I've always had sort of a pretty intrinsic or just gut feeling about how to raise my kids, and I'm really quite close with my parents, and so kind of when I am feeling uncertain, I have trusted people in my life that I can turn to and ask for questions. But in terms of the reporting on kids and anxiety and resilience, I have really been inspired to leave my kids alone, let them have more freedom, be less in their face. I just want them to feel that they have the freedom to become who they're going to be outside of whatever pressure, I may even unknowingly be putting on them. And I just, I'm so convinced about things like letting them walk with their friends to the park alone, walk to school alone, things that are obviously developmentally appropriate for them to do at the ages that they do. But I think less scrutiny on our kids from us is really important. That doesn't mean ignoring them when they're coming to us with problems. Like, that's not what I'm saying at all. But giving them more space, honestly, to mess up sometimes, because we all make mistakes. I mean, I certainly made a lot of mistakes as a teen and young adult. But I think really letting them have some more space and freedom and not micromanaging every minute of their day. I think it also makes our lives easier and leaves us more time for, grown-up pleasures, which I think part of the reason we all feel so, afraid and stressed is because we don't have time for our own interests. So yeah, I would say, obviously I'm not going to be like, let your 2-year-old go to the park by themselves. Like, no, that's not what I'm saying. But as your kids get older and it is developmentally appropriate for them to do more things by themselves, let them do it.
And kind of given all that, what do you think we're still leaving out of the conversation when it comes to parents and their mental health and who gets permission to be human and make mistakes?
Yeah, I think the importance of a supportive community around you cannot be overstated. And that doesn't just necessarily mean a spouse or partner. It can mean friends. It can mean uncles, aunties, anyone who constitutes your own community. Just having those people in a stable, ongoing way, and reciprocating with them, because it feels really good to be able to help somebody else when they need help. I think, again, it seems so basic, but it just means everything. I think having friends that I have a friend that I sometimes will call her and say, I'm really angry at my spouse or my kids right now, and I don't want to yell at them. So I just need to vent to you. Like, I need to call you. You don't even need to say anything. I'm just going to talk at you for 5 minutes. And we have that together. Like, she'll do the same for me. And having those sorts of outlets, beyond important.
Well, I'm so sad to say that, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today, but I could obviously keep having this conversation with you forever. So thank you so much, Jessica, for your time today and sharing all this great insight with us.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure.
Thank you. And I'm now going to kick this over to Carrie Copham, who's the fellowships director at the 19th and someone who's covered mental health as a journalist herself. Thank you again, Jessica.
Thank you, Jen. So today we're going to talk about mental health care for BIPOC communities, and I'm excited to have with us today Dr. Jenny Wang, clinical psychologist, author, and founder of Asians for Mental Health, Dr. Joy Harden Bradford, the founder of Therapy for Black Girls and a licensed psychologist, and Adriana Alejandre, the founder of Latinx Therapy and a trauma therapist. Good to have you all with us today.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. So the United States has been grappling with a mental health crisis, and I think by extension, the world for a while. And then you add in the last 3 years of the pandemic, when there's been isolation, there's been loss, trauma. We've seen our social infrastructures not meet us where we need to be. And so I think, it's so important for us to talk about the anxiety, the loneliness, the stigma that exists in our communities today. And so I'm just really excited to have you here. So I'm going to start with a question for all of you. First, I'd love for our audience to get to know you a bit better. So can you tell us a bit about your background, your work, and what inspires you to do what you do? And Dr. Joy, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you. So as you mentioned, I am a psychologist and the founder of the platform Therapy for Black Girls, which includes a therapist directory, as well as a weekly podcast and a private membership community. And really all of our work is centered on making mental health more relevant and accessible for Black women and girls. I know we will dive into more of the stigma related to mental health, but it felt really important for me to create a space and resources for Black women and girls to really be able to prioritize their mental health, for them to be able to tap into conversations and strategies to really help them to figure out how to better take care of themselves. So I'm really excited about all of the incredible work we've been doing. I'm also releasing my first book this summer called Sisterhood Heals, that really is like a culmination and a celebration of Black women's relationships with one another. So I'm excited to continue that conversation through the book as well.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm going to pass the mic to Dr. Jenny Wang.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So, I'm a clinical psychologist, and so I have a private practice here in Houston, but then I also created the platform Asians for Mental Health on social media. And really, it was just wanting to center the voices of Asian diaspora in kind of the topic of mental health, because it's still such a highly stigmatized topic within our communities, across our elders, across our different generations. And so wanting to speak to the unique nuances of being a child of immigrants, perhaps, a child who's raised in a country that sometimes doesn't feel like a homeland to us, and what it's like to live in that kind of in-between space. So Asians for Mental Health similarly has a therapist directory for Asian identified therapists, and really just trying to increase kind of access to culturally reverent and informed care.
Thank you, Dr. Jenny. Adriana.
Yes. So I'm officially a licensed marriage and family therapist here in the state of California, and I do own a group practice called EMDR and Trauma Therapy Center, where we provide services for individuals, couples, and families that experience trauma and anxiety primarily, but open to other lived experiences as well. And outside of this group practice, I am the founder of Latinx Therapy, where I am a speaker, a consultant. Latinx Therapy focuses on destigmatizing mental health myths and taboos in the Latinx community. And like Dr. Joy and Dr. Jenny Wang, we also have a directory, a national directory of Latinx therapists, where I believe now 97% of our directory members are Spanish speakers. There's also a speakers directory for therapists that are also keynote speakers and panelists. So it's really exciting to work with a lot of these therapists on the platform and amplify one another and our work, because a lot of times being in private practice, it's, we're behind closed doors, right? Working with our clients. And so this membership serves to create community and also provide education to our community about mental health in English and in Spanish.
Thank you. This is such a powerhouse panel, so I'm happy to be able to chat with the three of you today. So one of the things that came up when pretty much all of you were introducing yourselves was around stigma in your communities. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about sort of what kind of challenge does that pose for you in the work that you do and the help that you're trying to provide?
I think a lot of times there's been a lot of miseducation about what mental health even is in the Asian American community. A lot of times in our homelands, the reference points were severe psychosis, institutionalization, very severe forms of mental disruption. And so I think when, you know, a lot of our parents immigrated to the US, that was something that it was like, our people don't do that, right? We don't do mental health. We don't do therapy. And so in some ways, it also became something where it was very much silenced. If people did struggle, it was very hush hush. We didn't openly discuss it. And in fact, when we did, we felt like we would be tarnishing the reputations of our parents, our community, the people that we came from, right? So there's a deep sense of silence and also shame surrounding mental health. And so a lot of times, you know, either when I'm working with clients or speaking, you know, in corporate settings, a lot of it is realizing that that silence actually breeds worse mental health outcomes. And so a lot of my time is spent almost like re-educating and normalizing and helping people realize that mental health is rooted in our relationships, in how we live our lives, the actions and choices that we make, and helping people see that mental health is every single minute of every day. That is what mental health really is.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I really appreciate that answer, Dr. Jenny, because I think in a lot of ways in the Black community, it's a very similar kind of a narrative. And I think the additional piece of religion and spirituality being a large part of Black communities' experience, right? And so this idea that mental illness comes from not having a strong enough faith relationship or that you're cursed in some way, when really, you know, you can pray and also see a therapist, right? I think it's really important for people to understand that those things are not mutually exclusive. And so it's not a denouncing of your faith relationship to say that you also see a therapist. And again, the expansion of the conversation of mental health being something that we all have to take care of, right? Like that it actually exists along a spectrum. So it's not that only people who have severe mental illness need to do something. There are things that all of us need to be doing to take care of our mental health.
Absolutely. I resonate with that. My community shares similar experiences, if not the same, to a very close degree. And so to add a different light to this, I think when I started my platform, one of the stigmas that I remember from childhood and growing up is that one, in Spanish is la terapia es para locos, that therapy is only for crazy people, as you were just referencing, right, Dr. Joy, that it's for extreme cases. And that's not the case. I think, you know, in expanding Latinx therapy, it's really learning that, learning and teaching that therapy is not just for rock bottom moments, that it can very much be preventative and even not just necessarily going into therapy, but learning about your mental health, creating that awareness is prevention. Because as you mentioned, Dr. Jenny, right, when we stay silent in it, it can become very dangerous for ourselves and the people around us. And all three of us as well come from very collectivistic cultures where we tend to prioritize the needs of other people versus our own individual needs. And so learning about how mental health can impact one and how it could help one, it actually ends up benefiting others as well. And so these are just things, though, that we have to reframe, that we have to learn about. And I think that's why our platforms exist, is to combat these stigmas, these myths, these misconceptions and taboos. Within my lived experience, and also for, I'm sure for many of our people in our community, we also don't learn about mental health because it's so much of a stigma until we're in like college years, you know, young adulthood ages, when there's something that happens to us, most likely, where somebody ends up telling us, hey, I think you know, it may be helpful to consider therapy, or it may be helpful to talk about this with someone else. Because growing up, even the expression of emotions was so oppressed, right? We couldn't even show anger. We couldn't even show sadness. And so learning how to accept these emotions and express them becomes so challenging when we're, I mean, at any age, but definitely when we're interacting in relation to other people and with others. So stigmas everywhere, and, you know, in all contexts of our lives.
Yeah. I mean, definitely, I know Stigma is a big one. We could probably spend the entire panel just talking about stigma, and we would fill the entire time. But what would you say, and I'm going to go around the room one more time, so to speak. What would you say outside of the stigma is one of the biggest barriers to mental health care access that is facing your community today? And I'll go in reverse order and ask Adriana to go first.
Sure, thank you. So for my community, largely and historically, it's been not having providers that speak Spanish and or indigenous languages. And still that's still a struggle. Representation matters. We hear that time after time in different settings, in therapy as well. It's very different to experience therapy with a translator in the room with you while you're trying to be vulnerable. There is a disruption. There is a need to build rapport with both, the therapist and also the translator. And typically that's also not their role, or they choose for that to not be their role. And so language accessibility has been huge for us in our community, being able to find someone that is also culturally congruent, affirming, that identifies with you, that shares similar lived experiences, and can also digest, or rather help you understand the concepts of mental health and therapy in digestible ways. As a provider myself that is bilingual, that's been my biggest barrier and challenge for my community, is having to teach myself these concepts from graduate school and these advanced trainings now as a licensed professional, and having to translate them myself for the sake of my community being able to digest them. So I need to digest it. I need to take time, and then I need to learn how to say it. And that makes my bilingual brain hurt a little bit sometimes, but with the help of my community, right, it makes it a little bit easier. But nonetheless, it's still a barrier.
Thank you. And Dr. Jenny, what are you saying?
Yeah, I would say that similarly, language is a huge barrier. And, the term Asian Americans is a very wide one. So when you think about all the different ethnic groups and the ways of immigration here to the United States, we're talking about, 20, 30, 40 potentially or more different languages and dialects. And so I think that has been a huge challenge, and especially for people of perhaps my generation or younger who are more open to mental health, but then we don't know what the words are when we're trying to explain it to our parents, right? That older generation. And so sometimes the concepts translate and sometimes they don't. They're not necessarily certain words for diagnoses in some cultures. And so I think even getting to a similar kind of conversational ground is half the battle, kind of what Adriana was mentioning earlier. I think also that kind of cultural and also racial reverence piece is really big. I think as Asian Americans, we're kind of seen as almost this like middle space, like we're going through different struggles that may not always resonate with many different communities. And so sometimes I feel like for many of my clients, they have felt like their race was never acknowledged. They were part of what people call an invisible race here in the United States. And yet, post-pandemic, with the rise of anti-Asian hate, our race became so much more salient. And many of us didn't have the language or the words to even process our own experiences. So I think in many ways, finding a therapist who perhaps understands some of those similarities, who understands intergenerational traumas that people from Asia have come with, all of those things are really hard to find. I always say marriage or dating or finding a therapist is like dating, right? It's like finding that nice dance with somebody that is safe and that you can trust.
Right, but then who also like just understands fundamental things about how you were raised and the challenges that you may have experienced it and how that might have impacted you before you even came in the door, right? And that's
Absolutely.
a big deal.
Yes. And I think the piece of not seeing our cultural values as a deficit, right? I think there's something about kind of Western models of mental health that say, oh, that cultural practice is the reason why you have this mental health problem, instead of understanding the value of it and the limitations of it.
Right. 100%. Dr. Joy, how about you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would echo the same sentiments. I think for all of us, like a lack of culturally responsive providers, but at this point where we are kind of in the pandemic, I think a lack of providers overall is really difficult. I don't know that I know any therapists that really don't have a wait list right now, and so I think the rise in mental health, or the rise of people seeking mental health, of course, is great, but the provider bandwidth has not been able to keep up, right? And so I think that is an additional barrier, in addition to the stigma that we talked about. I think an additional barrier is finances/insurance. So I think, we cannot deny that, quality care is expensive in a lot of ways. And so, a lot of people can't afford it, especially as we have a looming recession and, those kinds of things. But the other thing I think we have to pay attention to is that insurance companies have not necessarily made it easy for providers to kind of keep up with taking insurance and also being able to support themselves in their lives, right? And so what we're seeing is that lots of therapists are unfortunately not even able to accept insurance anymore, because it became such a hassle to be able to be paid for the services that they were providing, which then means that clients are not able to use the benefits that they've been paying for. And so it feels like there's this tension that has been created between like therapists and clients related to insurance, when really it is not the therapist's issue, right? So I think we do have to pay attention to that as an additional barrier, in addition to the things we've talked about.
Yes, I had on my list to talk about today the fact that, there's so many people who may have insurance, and even if you have insurance, you can't find a provider who's covered. And then the federal law around parity and what that looks like state by state is also very confusing. And so the access can be difficult. And this is one of those topics that, again, we could talk about for the rest of the time, like all the barriers to getting access to mental health care. But what I wanted to talk about was, if you are experiencing barriers to accessing care or to accessing mental health services, what else can you do for your mental health? What is practical outside of the bounds of the system that may not be working for us right now?
I think what's lovely is that we have a lot of mental health professionals from diverse backgrounds who are writing books, right? Dr. Joy has a book coming out, and my book came out in last May as well, where they're really centering voices of different communities. And I think that's so exciting for the mental health space, because it means that you may not be in crisis, you may not necessarily need a therapist right now, but people are offering their expertise, their experiences with clients in tangible books, right, that have tools and questions and prompts. And I think sometimes when you read some of these books, you can almost imagine a therapist saying these things to you, like these questions and prompts. And so I think those options are out there. And I think that's why a lot of professionals spend a lot of time writing these books, is because we know that we're not going to see every single person that needs help, but a book is something that they can pick up, hopefully, or read, an ebook and have access to that. I'm also a big proponent that our bodies hold things related to our mental health in a way that we don't fully understand. And so we know that movement, stretching, exercise, rhythmic dancing, drum circles, things that are embodied somatic movements help the body regulate the nervous system. And so even going for a walk today, even moving your body, has benefits to mental health. And I always say to my clients, if you're not doing the basics, sleeping, eating, right, connecting, right, with people, spending time outside, if you're not doing those things, then all these other things that you try to put on top of it are going to be really shaky. So I think those basic human needs are things that we could all do today, and in fact, improve on if we're already doing them.
Thank you for that reminder. Thank you. Needed it.
Yeah, I would just add to that, in addition to books, there are a plethora of podcasts. So I'm very excited that there are so many, credible mental health podcasts from licensed professionals talking about some of the things that Dr. Wing is talking about. So again, I think because we come from identities and communities where we know, psychology and the mental health field was not necessarily built for us, it's been really exciting to see so many professionals like create these resources to be able to serve our communities in the ways that we might not be able to in our individual offices. And so I think being able to plug into podcasts or worksheets, or, lots of therapists are creating courses and offering workbooks and all kinds of different things for people to be able to tap into. So I think making sure that you're keeping your eyes open for those kinds of resources. The other thing that I'm really excited about that I hope I see more of are groups. So therapy groups, support groups, like I feel like there's, more of that now, but I think we could use more, just because again, there are not enough therapists to go around for everybody who would want to have individual therapy. But I do think the power of group therapy is something we have not tapped into enough. And so I would love to see, an increase in groups being offered in community centers, through private practices, support groups facilitated by community members. I think, as Adriana mentioned, having a more collectivist background really lends itself to people being able to heal in community within groups. And so I'd like to see people really kind of take up that banner as well.
Yeah, I think there definitely is a power in groups, and always a need, definitely. So I was going to mention that, but I also had the thought of how powerful our minds are. And this exercise is something that I teach people in my communication skills workshop group, and then also in my practice, in which I think it's really important for us to look at ourselves in the mirror and talk to ourselves, say what we want to say out loud, and not just keeping things in our mind, because in our mind, sometimes we may have a different voice, but then when we hear, our own self out loud, it could come out very differently than how we imagined it would. So I always encourage people to practice saying things out loud and practice kind dialogue as well to themselves, because there's so many people that suffer very silently in a very critical self-talk type of way. So I definitely recommend for us to just express kindness and just practice communicating out loud within ourselves to ourselves in front of a mirror, so that you could also learn what your nonverbal language expression looks like. And besides that, just on the more like logistical note, there are therapy funds out there that like the Loveland Foundation. I just created the Alejandra Foundation. There is, if they're still around, Brown Sister Speaks, and other ones that I've promoted on my page that provide also therapy services. They reimburse you for your therapy or pay the therapist directly. And so these are other ways maybe to get access to mental health therapy services. And there's usually also resources available on their websites for other alternatives to therapy as well.
I want to flip this around a little bit, because we're talking about folks who are seeking access to mental health care. But what if, you're watching this today and you're one of the folks who is privileged enough to have mental health care, or to be able to afford to pay for it. So you have privilege, or you have access to services. Is there anything that you can do to help make mental health resources more available and more accessible to others?
Yeah, this is a great question, because it can get very creative with people that are able to, just have access to their own services. But since launching Latinx Therapy, I have worked with individuals who have brought this idea to me, where they fund therapy sessions at a certain rate for an X number of people. And I think that's a really wonderful way of giving back to the community. And sometimes, people think like, well, what about HIPAA and what about confidentiality, right? They don't have, they provide the payment essentially, and then the services are paid for up front. So anyways, there's logistics. If anybody watching is able to do that, just contact someone who can engage in that, contact directory services, right? Like ourselves, and we can probably work it out in some way. But another way is for, as Dr. Joy, I believe you were the one that mentioned groups. And if individuals want to lead a peer support group, you can go ahead and do that, right? There's a lot of research. I know Mental Health America actually has a curriculum, a public curriculum as to how you can go ahead and organize a peer-led support group and facilitate that, essentially just create a space. Or even co-working spaces are great. Those are not necessarily support groups, but just being in community with other people.
Yeah, I love this question because I think it really orients towards what community care looks like and what it could look like across communities. And I always say that, like, if I'm a regulated person, then I show up that way with the people that I touch, right? My kids, my parents, the people that are in my life. And so I think one of the ways that we can dispel some of the myths is, if we're comfortable sharing, talk to people about how we go to therapy, right? And I'll tell my kids, mommy has a therapy session today, or so you got to be quiet, but mommy's going to have a session, right? And it's one of those things where we start to normalize it and we actually tell people about the benefits of it. Because I think therapy can be really scary, right? And in our community, it's like, why would you pay a stranger to talk about our family secrets, right? That feels like a big no-no. When in fact, when we create space for ourselves to be in therapy, it actually frees us up, right, to really work on the things that improve our lives. And we also don't need to be projecting our stuff to all these people that we love. And so I think that we are the best kind of advertising for therapy. If we've seen benefit, then let's talk about it. If we've taken medication and it's been beneficial, let's talk about it. And I think that then creates a lot of ripple effects for others.
Yeah, Dr. Wang, it's funny because I often get the question from people like, how do I encourage my partner to go to therapy? Or how do I get my dad into therapy, right? And really modeling that, like you just said, modeling what you've learned in therapy and that you've had a great relationship with the therapist, or you've had, benefits from medication, is the best way to get somebody else to go to therapy, because then they can see the tangible changes you've made in your life and they can see the changes that have happened in your relationship. And so I think when we think about trying to get other people to therapy, it's really important to look at, again, ourselves as walking billboards and really allowing that to speak for itself.
Yeah, indeed. So I have some individual questions for y'all, and we can talk about those. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Joy. So I read somewhere that you like using pop culture analogies to really bring home psychological concepts to your clients. So what is one of your favorite pop culture anecdotes that you use to really drive those things home?
Ooh, this feels like an unfair question because I feel like so many good pop culture references. But I feel like one of my favorites is from the show Girlfriends. So for those who are not familiar, Girlfriends was a show that was on, I think in the early 2000s, for Black women who were friends in California about, their lives and like the happenings of what was going on. And so in season 3, there was one of the characters named Tony who got engaged. And her best friend, Joan, was somebody who was kind of like always wanting to be partnered, but it just was never really happening for her. So Tony got engaged first. And what we saw in season 3 was that Joan threw the engagement party, but in the middle of the engagement party had her ex-boyfriend come over to like collect his box of things that he had left at the home, right? And so I think that that is just a great illustration of what happens when we avoid difficult conversations with other people in our life, right? So clearly Joan had been struggling with the idea that her best friend got engaged before she did, but didn't feel like it was appropriate to share that. And so instead of actually verbalizing like, hey, I'm really struggling with this. Can we talk about it? What happens is that she acts out in the middle of the engagement party, right? And I think a lot of people can recognize that for themselves, like experiences they've had where they didn't want to say something, but they ended up like acting out what was happening anyway. So I think that that's just a great example of really the importance of having difficult conversations, even if they're awkward. I think people are often afraid to have some of those awkward, difficult conversations because they are afraid it means that the relationship will be over, or, you know, this friend will never forgive me for saying I'm jealous, when really what often happens is that the relationship becomes closer.
Thank you. That was, I was interested in hearing what it was going to be, and it did not disappoint.
Juicy story.
So, Dr. Wang, you answered this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to dig a little bit more into your book. You talked about the importance of professionals like yourself putting together your stories, especially the ones that impact your community. Can you tell us a little bit more about your book and kind of why you decided that now was the time?
Yeah, so the book is called Permission to Come Home, Reclaiming Mental Health as Asian Americans. And I think I wanted this book to be a love letter to our community. You know, it came out over the course of the pandemic. I was writing much of it while we were under lockdown. And this was at the same time that we were getting videos and footage of our Asian elders getting pushed on the streets or being attacked, you know, and people having to at some point go back to work, and they were scared to get on the subways because there were Asian American women who were being pushed in front of them. And so it was a very terrifying time for our community. And I think one in which many of us felt sometimes helpless. How do we get out of this, right? How do we move through this? And so I think the book really came at a time in our community's kind of almost a journey where we needed some tangible tools, right? And every chapter is a permission to do something, permission to rage, permission to take up space, permission to feel, permission to grieve. And I wanted our community to feel like they could claim permission to do those things. Because like Adriana mentioned earlier, we were never taught to feel anything, right? And so much of it was, can we turn inward and tolerate the discomfort of facing the really painful things of our lives that we had long suppressed? And so I think this book was a love letter, but it also was a tangible thing that I could leave my kids, who will one day be young adult Asian Americans, questioning who they are, questioning if they belong, questioning where they came from. And I wanted them to have a resource to be able to turn towards those questions.
Thank you for sharing that. Adriana, you mentioned this like off the top that you do work in EMDR. And for the folks who may not be as familiar with what it is, can you tell us a little bit about what is EMDR? And then are there challenges that are specific to the Latinx community that it's been particularly successful in addressing or helping?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So EMDR is an acronym for eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. It's a type of therapy that uses bilateral stimulation, left and right movement. It originated with left and right movement of the eyes, but it can be left and right movement of the hands. So if we just tap like this is called a butterfly hug, in order to help the brain heal from the specific experience that you're going to be working on with your therapist. And so this type of therapy uses 8 phases in order to help you process, and there is a phase where you gather the history about it, then you prepare for this type of therapy, because it isn't like talk therapy. There's drastically less talking. There is more stimulation than talking, because your brain and your body are going to be getting activated from this specific chosen problem you're going to bring up. And this problem can be a belief you have about yourself based off of something that happened. It can be a sensation in your body. There may not even be a memory connected to it, because sometimes things happen in our infancy or childhood and we can't articulate it. Or there could be an image, a precise memory. So you can choose, a different, a sensation, an image, or a belief of what you want to process. And it's really a beautiful type of therapy. Of course, I'm biased in it because I've been providing it for years and I've seen the success in it. But, to your second question, in regards to, are there any challenges particularly to the Latinx community? I'm going to just spread that out to marginalized communities, because as we're hearing in this panel, we share so many different experiences. I have worked with people that have traumas due to immigration. And again, so many of our cultures can experience that as well. It's been successful in so many different areas of people's lives. Again, immigration, or it can be due to anxiety, it can be addictions, it can be helpful for the way that we perceive ourselves and or others. There's just so many different things that it helps, it's effective for. So it's really difficult to target, but I will say that it's, I guess, specific to the Latinx community, using it in Spanish, because now they have access to EMDR. Terapia ocular is how I refer to it with my clients after I explain what it is. And so I think it's been successful because it can be used, in that way. And we change the metaphors in a way that is helpful to our community.
I have one more question for you, Dr. Joy, and then we're going to go into our final question of the panel. You mentioned earlier that you had a book coming out, and I'm gonna lob the same question to you about, can you tell us a little bit about it and why you felt like it was needed now?
So it's called Sisterhood Heals, the transformative power of healing in community, which I feel like is a beautiful summation of the conversation we're having today. And I think it is really important to focus on our relationships with one another, because it can be, I think Dr. Wing mentioned this earlier, this idea of things that we hold as secrets and that we are afraid to say out loud. But then you get into a group, or you're having a late night chat session with your girlfriend, and you say this thing that you've finally been holding, and you realize, like, oh my gosh, it wasn't so scary, and this person can hold it for me. And so I think as we are kind of moving into whatever this phase is of the pandemic we are in right now, people are really wanting to figure out, like, how do I rebuild relationships? What does it mean for me to even show up in community? Like, how do I hold space for other people? But how do I also ask for people to hold space for me? And so the book is really a celebration of the relationships that Black women have with one another, and how we are often each other's lifeline, and a guide to how to do that better.
Okay, sounds like folks are going to have a TBR list at the end of today's session.
Indeed.
Okay, so for each of you, there are some very unique challenges in the work that you do. And what I am interested in wrapping up with are, tell me about the things that give you hope. The things that give you hope in mental health access, or anything related to mental health in your community.
Well, I think, I remember going to graduate school and being one of the only, if not only, Asian in so many settings. And so what gives me hope is this next generation of Asian therapists who are sometimes going against their parents' wishes and becoming a therapist or becoming a psychologist and going against the stigma within our culture and saying, this is something that matters and we want to be a part of that. And so I think when I see these, young graduate students, young interns, postdocs, that gives me hope because it makes me realize that there are generations to come who will continue to be dedicated to our community and providing care that makes people feel safe and heard. And I'm also just really galvanized by young people. People love to say like, oh, these young people, this and that. And I'm like, but they're doers and they're movers and they're shakers. And they're using their unique talents and gifts to be creative and to start movements and to fight back. And that gives me hope, even though sometimes it feels like every day there's something to feel hopeless about. But I have to believe that these young people will give us the future that they want for themselves, and that we as older folks, hopefully, are good mentors and cheerleaders for them.
I'm also really excited about just the vulnerability that I see Black women and Black people in general really sharing about their mental health experiences. I think that every time somebody is able to say like, I've struggled with this thing and here's how I'm trying to take care of myself, it gives someone else the privilege and the opportunity to say, oh, I can say this thing too, or I can also get help for this thing. And so I've just been really encouraged by people getting on social media saying like, oh, I had this great session with my therapist today. Let me tell you what they told me. Right. And so really being able to kind of be proud about, receiving support and offering other people things that might be helpful for them. Right. Like, I think there isn't always clarity around what you can talk with the therapist about. And so people being very open to sharing their own experiences with therapy, I think also expands other people's possibilities of what therapy can be used for.
Definitely. And my brain is like ping-ponging all over the place with different answers. So I'm trying to ground myself with just one thing. But, when I launched my podcast, one of the most memorable things that I remember from going viral is that people were just emailing me. Like in the beginning, I got maybe like over 20 emails a week or something like that. It was pretty difficult to keep up for me. And all of them were like, I never realized I can choose a Latinx therapist. I never thought I had a choice. I always just went with whatever was given to me. They all shared that theme of just like, they craved to heal and they never thought that they had a right to choose their provider. And so it gives me hope that our communities crave and long to heal and long to break generational cycles and long to not be oppressed anymore. And yes, like I think all generations are definitely doing their part and doing the best they can, given the stigmas that they've grown up with and have witnessed. And so I see a lot of hope in the direction that we're doing. I mean, all of us here have created something our communities needed, and our communities are using them, which is why we continue to be in existence. So the hope is there and it's beautiful. And I think us as leaders and our communities we're doing something together and it's working.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a great note to end on because we need hope. So I thank you for all of your thoughtful responses today, for your time. We appreciate you being with us. And I'm really most excited for folks to hear from you all today because so many gems were dropped. So I appreciate you all. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And we're going to go to Amanda Zamora, the 19th's co-founder and publisher.
I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of today's speakers for these critical conversations and to all of you for joining us today. I'm also thrilled to remind you that our 4th annual 19th Represents Summit is next month from May 18th to May 20th. You can watch along with us virtually all 3 days or join us in person in downtown Chicago on May 20th. To save your spot, sign up now at summit.19thnews.org. We hope to see you there.